Dear guests, it is a long, long time ago. Nobody knows how long, but I guess a good 6,000 years. And there were gigantic spaceships revolving around the good old Earth. How? About everything in the world. Do you want to know that? You know it from ancient India. The Indians wrote diligently. And in many ancient Indian texts, you can read in detail thousands of years ago, gigantic spaceships would have turned around the Earth. The ancient Indians did not call these buildings spaceships. They called them cities on the firmament. They had no word for spaceships. Suddenly smaller vehicles would have appeared in these buildings, and one day smaller vehicles would have descended to Earth from these cities on the firmament. The ancient Indians called these vehicles vimanas, and they described them so precisely that it was possible for us to put fight engineers behind it. We analyzed the ancient Indian text sentence by sentence by sentence. We wanted to know what you have to imagine under a vimana, and this is the result. Today there are different types of aircraft. Everyone knows helicopters, jumbo jets, one-engine small machines, vertical launchers, just like in old India. There are 18 different Vimana types described. The Vimana type here is described as absolutely silent. The people would be frightened if huge shadows would be hovering over the valleys from the bright sky. The animals would have croaked, the birds would have stopped chirping. These buildings would have made individual landings and taken people to these cities on the firmament. Then you read in an ancient Indian text, there was a war of the gods. 3 of these cities appeared on the firmament. Glistening bright rays were observed, the cities were destroyed, and from the earth it looked as if tens of thousands of stars were falling down. Now you can ask yourself if that was so, if individual people were taken up into these cities, if they were subjugated, that must have happened on earth. After all, we have an evolution, a history of development. Not only an evolution in biology, but also an evolution in technology. Then we speak of technical progress. Everything we have today had to be invented, had to be discovered, had to be tested. But if thousands of people were handed over to some spaceship up there, they would have brought the things that have no development of technology behind them. There should be things emerging that do not fit into the evolution of technology. How do you deal with that? Are there such things? The planet is full of them. Here are 2 or 3 examples. In 1899, Greek scuba divers discovered a wreck in the small island of Antikythera, 18 meters deep at Ypres, 18 meters deep at... All kinds of debris came to the surface. One day, a round lump was glued to the surface with seabed. A young archaeologist in the basement of the National Museum of Athens tried to scrape away the seabed with a metal brush. Suddenly, he came across a layer of metal, and when the first layer crumbled, he got scared. He meant to break something. He hadn't asked his boss before, so he stayed lying in a lump, 81 years in the basement of the National Museum of Athens. Only during renovation work, Professor Dr. Solar Pries literally steps on it.
What is this actually?
There is still an old inscription on it, found in 1899, in front of the island of Antikythera. Now, with modern means, with acid, they tried to get rid of the remnants of the sea. Metal layers reappeared. Then, very faintly visible, under a layer, something like letters. On the back, a large metal wheel, or rather a metal ring and 2 metal striations, placed crosswise, and then gear wheel. More and more gear wheels, the smallest as small as the diameter of the little finger. Then a regular scale appeared. You can observe in the picture, the scale still goes into this rusted material. On the back, a large gear wheel, and again many smaller gear wheels. And the amazement was not bad when you discovered a regular differential gear. Differential gears, dear guests, the highly modern technology, we need them in our cars. What was that strange apparatus? What was that supposed to be? It was quickly found out. The apparatus was a kind of planetarium in pocket format. It showed the planets of our solar system, but in relation to each other. So when Jupiter is up there, where does Mars stand in relation to Earth? Part of this strange machine are also the data of Pluto. Pluto, as you know, is a small planet, a tiny planet. We have just discovered it in 1930. Nobody could know anything about it, thousands of them. Of course, this is earthly technology. This is nothing extraterrestrial. You see, there is mechanics, gears. The question points in a different direction. Where did the creators of this device get their knowledge from? Who showed them anything about the orbits of the planets? And how did they know anything about the tiny Pluto? By the way, After the device lay in the basement for over 81 years, the pieces of broken glass that are still left are finally exhibited in the National Museum of Athens. Most tourists pass by and do not understand what kind of sensation they have in front of them. And there is the next riddle. This originates from 1901, from Istanbul. There, they renovated the Topkapi Palace. In an old wooden chest, the restorers discovered a map. The map was scribbled on gazelle skin in 4 different colors, and you knew very quickly who drew the map. It was the Turkish Admiral Piri Reis. He drew the map in 1513. Thank God, Piri Reis not only drew, he also wrote. In an accompanying letter, he noted that he had put together this map from a package of much older maps that had been given to him in Alexandria. No one in the world has a map like this. What is so extraordinary about it? At the top right, you can still see the southern tip of France. Then follows Spain. Finally, the point where Gibraltar would be today. You can see the upper part of Africa, but what is actually on the lower edge of the map? The map of Piri Reis landed on the tables of several cartographers at universities. These gentlemen were making a reading grid, transferred the old map to a globe. And look, the lower part is definitely Antarctica, with the exact coastline, with all the sea bays, with pre-located islands. Every position is there. But an Antarctic that has been under eternal ice and snow for us since human memory. Nobody could know anything about it. Even the Turkish Admiral Piri Reis, who drew this map in 1513, could not know the Antarctic. It was not yet discovered at that time. All positions are very precise. How is this riddle explainable? One thing is undisputed. Someone must have mapped an ice-free Antarctica in prehistoric times. Have you ever been to Peru? The picture you see here I made at an altitude of 3,500 meters above the Peruvian city of Cusco. This is a classic Inca wall. Many edges without mortar. Earthquake-proof. And when you are there, I recommend you to crackle up the mountain. At 4,000 meters. My dear, 3,800 meters. Attention, thin air. You feel every heartbeat. Do not strain yourself. You also feel every beat in your sleep, and the higher you get, the more you experience an incredible landscape. What you see here has nothing to do with Inca technology. This is a pre-Inca culture. Rocks have been processed, cut in an incomprehensible way for us. In this picture, you see smooth edges, and the next rock on the right is so close that the quarry would not even have had the opportunity to knock it out with a hammer. Someone, as it seems, has cut up pieces of rock, like one of us, a piece of cheese. It must have become heat, because you can always find glazes on the edges. By the way, there are no volcanoes nearby. Every time I crawl in there, I ask myself what happened here thousands of years ago. The upper part seems to be granite, and then sharp edges followed, just as if it were concrete, as if a few years ago the wooden shell had been removed. Now you can see steps on the ceiling on the picture. Nobody can step on the stairs. You can't walk on your head. That means the whole block and everything was put on the head by some kind of explosion. Now everything was already here when the Spanish conquerors came. The Spaniards asked the Incas who lived here what it was, and they answered very naively, it still comes from the times of the gods. Which gods? Please. Just as dramatic it will be at an altitude of 4,100 meters. Here we are on the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca. The place is called Pumapunku. You don't see a single tree at an altitude of 4,100 meters. Nothing grows anymore. If we talk about 4,100 meters in our broad degrees, then we land in eternal ice and snow. Here, therefore, not because we are closer to the equator. There are huge platforms of andesite, granite and diorite across and across. Diorite, dear viewers, is a deep rock. Diorite is harder than granite. There is a hard scale. The hardest thing we have here is the diamond. On the scale, the diamond. On the scale, the diamond has the value number 10. Diorite, for comparison, has the value number 8 on the hard scale. In order to process diorite, you definitely need hard metal. Forget all the Urwald woods, bones, and whatever else appears in the literature. Not with diorite. Now the experts are of the opinion we had to do with the remains of a temple of the highland India. These were the Aymara, wonderful, lovable people. Their descendants still live today. But where they came from, the Aymara were stuck in the Stone Age. They could not have processed diorite. The largest platform was originally, when it was found at the end of the last century, 89 meters on a single piece. Today, it is broken into 3 parts. The estimated weight is 900 tons. The estimated weight is 900 tons. Thin air. No wood, no wooden rolls. They would not have moved a meter on a 900-ton platform. Originally, the huge chunks were attached together with clamps. Copper would not work because of the temperature differences. It is too soft. Wood also not. We do not know what it was. For my part, I was in the highlands of Bolivia 25 years ago. I was there when the excavations and in the ground one always discovered such strange tube pieces. At first glance it looks like a water pipe. Imagine what you have here in the picture would be a water pipe. For the water transport you need the lower part of the pipe. This is the actual water channel in which the water would flow. Now you could say, well, the two pieces have shifted over the millennia. The piece on the left was maybe down, but it was not like that. We only found upper parts, like from the factory. What was it about here? I stood in front of corner pieces, was pretty confident. There must be lower parts under it. I got a chisel. We weighed the blocks out. There were no lower parts. What happened here before millennia? There are blocks which usually disappear in some archaeological drawer. You invent a name, for example, you say sacrificial blocks or sacrificial tables. These things up there don't fit in a drawer. Even in archaeology, you don't know where to put all of this. What was a block like this for? By the way, it's also a diorite, just like this block here. A blue-green deep rock and a very sharp groove on the front edge. Maybe you should also pay attention to the grinding of the other edges. Every few centimeters, a hole has been drilled into the groove. Every expert today tells me, Mr. von Daeniken, this only works with diamond drills. Otherwise, this technology cannot be produced. But we are talking about the Stone Age. Something is wrong here. If a bricklayer cuts something out of a block, hammers it out, scratches in its grooves, then of course because an object has to fit on it, and seamlessly without joints. That means planning has to be put behind it. This is not a small block here. It is at least 2.78 meters long. Now pay attention to the different edges, the different levels, the precision, the tiny rectangle with a space in between on the upper edge of the picture. Planning has to be behind it. And maybe one or the other viewer says, well, you shouldn't exaggerate. The blocks are there now, so you have to have done it somehow. Please ask yourself the additional question, why? What does a Stone Age society need this precision for? We made an effort. I had the help of technical draftsmen. I can't do this alone. The technical draftsmen unpacked their millimeter paper with their special tools and made exact measurements. At home we created a computer program. We wanted to know what actually fits in here. And very quickly you feel like a little donkey because it shows itself. It is all the way about prefabricated elements, like a Lego set that fits the Stone Age like the fist to the eye. There is, I said it at the beginning, not only an evolution in biology, there is an evolution in technology. After all, you learn technical progress. A car of today is much more refined than a car from 30 years ago. Here in the highlands of Bolivia, this evolution of technology has been completely put on the head. The oldest elements are the most perfect. After that, only ramsch came. Our ancestors left us mysterious things. What is this supposed to be, sir? The object comes from Copan. Copan is located in present-day Honduras. It is attributed to the Maya culture. Because one does not know what it is called an anthropomorphic figure. I could imagine something like a saddle where someone sits on it. And in the center, what kind of ball does he look out of? We do not have answers. Just as little as for these priests or god figures in Copan. A closer look shows that they all carry boxes on their chests, and with their 10 fingers they operate a keyboard. I am not of the opinion that they had computers. I just wonder what our ancestors observed in some ominous gods, did not understand, and then tried to imitate. And the planet is full of that. Here in Mexico, the place is called Villa Hermosa. It is a private archaeological park. There you can see how one of these gods is descending. If you look closely, you can even see something like a microphone in front of the lip. You can see the hands spread out downwards. The earth is tilted, the feet are hovering in the sky. Originally, when the stelae were not yet broken, there were still 3 human figures down there, who were looking at the sky in amazement. And one of the really incomparable riddles, which I personally always have great pleasure in, is here in the ground under this pyramid. The pyramid is in Palenque. Palenque is in Mexico. In 1949, all this was overgrown. A single jungle. Then Prof. Dr. Roots began with the excavations. At the top on the pyramid, one discovered 618 Mayan inscriptions. One could learn who ruled the city, from when to when, who ruled the city, from when to when, what were the rulers called. The ruling family here, by the way, was the Pakal family. Whenever I say Pakal, one corrects me and says Pascal. No, Pakal, not Pascal. Also at the upper end of the stairs was to make a right-angled crack. Stem iron was taken, a plate was lifted out of the ground, and a staircase was discovered inside. But at that time, in 1949, this staircase was full of stones up to the ceiling. Someone had to have hidden something down there and intentionally closed it again. It took 3 years until only the staircase was exposed. After all, you landed under the pedestal of the pyramid and stood in front of this triangular door. Such a thing had never been observed before. The door was brutally broken open with a chisel. That's why a piece is missing here, and the excavators looked into a 7-meter high space. The 7 meters are due to the fact that it goes down even deeper than you see in the picture here and even higher. Of course, no grid was installed in 1952. That came later. The chief excavator, Professor Dr. Roots, wrote in his excavation report, "We no longer dared our eyes. We looked into an ice cave. Everywhere there were ice caps. The ground was full of snow. Now we are here in the lowlands of Mexico. There is no ice and no snow. The ice caps unclogged as pebbles, stalactites, stalagmites, whole curtains, 7 meters long, and the snow was finally limestone powder. The pebbles were knocked away, the ground was cleaned and stood on this mighty plate. 3.80 meters long, 2.20 meters wide, a single block, around 9 tons heavy, and on top of that, carved in, a magnificent relief, a drawing for eternity. There's someone sitting leaning over in the front, almost like on a motorcycle. All around him you can see something like a frame, or so to speak, a frame. You can also see that he's sitting on a chair. The exact observation shows that a device is glued directly to the nose. The upper hand is slightly opened, as if it would operate the button. From the lower hand you can see the 4 fingers of the back of the hand angled. It turns something. Then the armchair, and outside the frame, something like a flaming flame. After the discovery, one was speechless in the Maya archaeology for the first time. How does such a plate with such a precise relief get under a pyramid? The tomb down there must be older than the pyramid, because the plate with a length of 3.80 meters and a width of 2.20 meters would never have been able to transport the narrow stairs down later. Only later was the pyramid built on it. But what should the representation say? In archaeology, you always look for reasonable solutions. After all, we all have to stand on the ground with both legs. And so they said to themselves, it can only be one of the rulers of Palenque, namely a family member of this ruling family, Pakal. It was assumed that the second last ruler of Pakal. Nevertheless, questions remained open. Why in this impossible position, just as if one was sitting on the motorcycle, leaning over in front? In addition, there were inscriptions all around, but they were contradictory. There were datum glyphs. You know the Mayan calendar, you know the Mayan dates, you know the datum glyphs, as they are called in Mayan archaeology. But these datum glyphs were contradictory. They did not speak for this ruler, Pakal. In addition, the Mayan dates are repeated every 52 years. One does not really know where to start. There was an expert who said, here you can clearly see a stylized corn cob in the center of the picture. So it was the corn god called Yum, Nox. Another scholar said no. This is a Mayan boy. He is sitting on a sacrificial altar. What you see on the far right of the picture has nothing to do with exhalation, fire, flames. These are just the stylized beards of the weather god. In a new textbook I have now read, here you could really clearly see on the upper picture in the middle, the corner tooth of the earth creature, and below the corner tooth of the beast. Both together would probably reflect the open wrath. It was a Mayan priest who fell into the abyss of the earth. But, as the same expert said, you can also see the cross of life. Dead and life are meant, or dead and rebirth. Dear viewers, we have become a strange society. I call it the Mitnicker Society. Something is being presented to us. And since we are all always so sensible, we have to stand in reality. We nod nicely. Look at the picture. Pretty in the middle. Do you recognize the cross of life? Have you anchored it deeply in your grey cells that this could only be the cross of life? There is no cross of life. The word cross of life. The word cross of life is nothing more than a hollow phrase that someone once put into the world. The rest of humanity blabbers on. And the poor students still have to learn this nonsense, otherwise they won't get their license and won't get anywhere. By the way, I am accused that it would not be okay to consider this wonderful picture as a cross. Picture. You would have to set up the picture. It would look like this. Now it is generally known, and I am proud to publicly stand on it, I am a fantast. I just want to give you to remember, it is the fantasts who hold the world in breath, and not the fortune tellers. If you ask of me, Mr. von Daeniken, you can only see it that way, only as a high image, never as a cross image. Then my fantasy goes through with me. Let's make a short trip, just a leap into another country. I'll be right back. Let's fly to Asia. No matter if India, Burma, or Java, in the entire Asian region you will find these temples. This strange shape is called stupa. It reminds us of a bell, bell handle, bell shape, bell base. In Buddhism, the stupa has several meanings. I want to spare them to you. One of the meanings is that the stupa is the vehicle to the world of the gods, or the means of transportation to the world of the gods. If a person wanted to feel like one of these ominous gods from the deliverance, he first had to wash thoroughly according to the Buddhist ritual. He had to jump into the river or into the pond. Then he had to powder and perfume himself and climb into the stupa. That's why there's someone sitting in every stupa. In this case, the young Buddha at his Buddhist temple. And what is he actually doing in there? He sits here with bent elbows and performs ritual hand movements. He imitates the gods. He thinks he is in the vehicle to the world of the gods. And then back to Palenque in Mexico. If we look at it this way, we would have the tower of the stupa, the bell tower of the stupa. In the middle he sits, and does his ritual hand movements with bent elbows. So, if you ask me, I am never allowed to see the picture as a cross-section, but only as a longitudinal picture. I should be right. There is a reasonable answer for everything. Maybe we just misunderstood it, misinterpreted it, and the explanation was actually quite simple. From Mexico, a leap into the faraway Egypt. There, in 1954, one discovered under the desert floor of Saqqara. Saqqara is about 30 kilometers away from the Great Pyramid. A hole in the earth, of course. You got spades and shovels, shoveled the sand away, and hit a wall. Under the wall the rock came out cleanly in the deep past, and at the very bottom was a door made of stone. Today it is metal. Back then, in 1954, it was stone. The stone door was sealed. It bore an unbroken seal of the pharaoh Zekhemet. Just for understanding, most spectators know Cheops. Cheops is said to have been the builder of the Great Pyramid. This was the 4th dynasty around 2500 BC. Cheops, which we are talking about here, would be the 3rd dynasty, so even older than Cheops. Now one found the door with an unbroken seal. One was very, very confident. We were lucky. We find down there the oldest mummy of the pharaoh, Cheops. In the course of the shaft, 2 more stone doors appeared. Again, both with unbroken seals from Zeramath. Finally, one reached an underground room, which was coarsely carved out of the rock, and in the middle of it stood a phenomenal sarcophagus. Normally, sarcophagi are made of granite. This one was a single block of alabaster. Alabaster looks like marble. It is a limestone shape, and usually sarcophagi have a lid. This one has a sliding door, just like in an animal cage. At the upper end of the sliding door, again a seal of the pharaoh Cheops, again unbroken. And then you could even recognize the remains of a huge, large bouquet of flowers. It must have been mighty, because after thousands of years the dust was still on it. Now we were absolutely sure that the mummy had to lie in this sarcophagus. Imagine it. 3 doors sealed, closed. Here the sliding door closed. Again a seal on top. And to say goodbye, someone has put a bouquet on it. So there must be a mummy in it, because they were sure in May 1954 a public grave opening was held. Down here in this room, lights were turned on. Journalists and diplomats were present. The head archaeologist at the time was Prof. Dr. Zakaria Gonim, a man who was absolutely brilliant and integral. The students, his colleagues, revered and loved him. He was always ready to have fun. Dr. Gonim went down on his knees with a small chisel in his hand. Then he pushed the sliding door a little bit up and then put a piece of wood underneath it so that it would slide down again, and then lit it up with a flashlight. And Professor Gonim became pale. The sarcophagus was empty. How is that possible? 3 doors sealed, sliding door closed, a seal on top, Blumenstrasse to say goodbye. And thousands of years later you come, and the sarcophagus is empty. At that time, journalists spotted, did the pharaoh get out of the dust? Professor Goni, of course, was terribly angry about these blunders. Because of him, everything was publicly staged. Just as the press people and the diplomats were gone, he went down there again. And now he crawled into the sarcophagus with his whole body. When he came out again, he was no longer addressable. Everyone who knew him, from humorous spiritual people, said he had such a glaring look. He didn't answer any more questions. Shortly afterwards, the highly respected scholar fell over Nile Bridge near Cairo. Suicide. This, in turn, did not leave his assistant in peace. The drama repeated itself. Now he is crawling in with his body. The assistant took care of it 2 days later with an overdose of sleeping pills. Now the old age management in Cairo was afraid. Here it spits. It no longer works with right things. That's why the metal grid and the metal door were attached and curtain locks were made. It was pure luck that I was at the right place at the right time. Namely, when the curtain locks had to be replaced because they were rusted, I slipped in there, could take a few pictures. I was immediately thrown out again. You have nothing to do with me any more, Mr. Nickel. Immediately away again. Of course, I didn't crawl into the sarcophagus. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be standing here and giving this lecture. But I didn't have the opportunity to do a thorough job. People always asked me later, why didn't you come in, or why didn't you push me into the camera? I didn't even make it in the 3 minutes of time I had. If you go to Saqqara today and explore the grave of the pharaoh Sekhmet, the grave is already sanded again. There are already 3 meters of sand above the entrance. The secret is still under the earth. But Egypt is still a country of great riddles. I played a game in South America earlier. I told you that the technology was not right. The oldest technology was the most perfect, and afterwards only rams came. I can do the same game here in Egypt. We are now in Abydos. Abydos lies on the Nile, and here is the great temple of the god Osiris. Temples, dear viewers, do not happen to be anywhere. Temples are always at historical points. Incidentally, this is not different with us. Somewhere there is a church, an old church. Yes, why? Because there was a pagan place of worship in paganism. Or because the tradition says that some saint died or was tortured here. Or because 2 children firmly claim that they had a Mother of God apparition here. Churches and temples do not stand anywhere. They always stand in historical places, just like here in Abydos. The legend says the temple of Abydos was built here because the head of the god Osiris was buried here. Osiris was the oldest god of the Egyptians, who came from the stars. The people worshipped him, but his brother Seth was jealous and murdered him. The legend says that Seth cut the body of Osiris into different parts and buried the different parts in different parts of Egypt. This is the reason why the temple of Abydos was built here. If you ever have the opportunity to come to Abydos, tell your guide if you know where the head is. He will lead you a few meters. He will lead you a few meters into the desert, and then you climb down the hole here. 24 meters. You stand in front of huge megaliths that have been built up to 80 tons. You don't get a razor blade in between. Look at the technology, the precision. The oldest technology of transport, of weight, of grinding, of cleanliness, is the most perfect. You can see it on the picture. On top behind there was only rust. We have removed the same riddle a few kilometers further. The place is called Abu Sir. There are stones lying around like rags. In various stones, drilling holes. What's the point? If you drill a hole in a wall, imagine something like a corkscrew, then press and turn it in there, the drill bit crumbles out, you have a little dirt on the floor. But there is another form of drilling, which is highly modern and has only been patented in the last century. That is the core drilling. With the core drilling it is different. There you have a hollow steel tube, and the steel tube is now pressed into the borehole with pressure. Most of the time it is reinforced at the tip with diamonds. The borehole does not crumble out on the ground in a bore. The borehole remains in the pipe. At the end of the pipe, something like a stone sausage comes out of the pipe. The core drilling is the most modern technology. In Abu Sir, core holes have definitely come into play. You can prove it. Where does the technology come from? We cannot answer the question. By the way, 4 meters above these drilling holes, there is a huge monolith. It is 4.20 meters long, shimmering blue. You cannot transport it. And when you are there, clap your hands on it with your fists. At every point you hit, you get a different sound. It sounds nice, and nobody has an explanation for it. This Saqqara is without a doubt one of the places that still delivers the most riddles in ancient Egypt. Under the desert floor there are kilometer-long tunnels. Kilometer long, not 100 or 200 meters. Kilometer. long tunnels, niche on the right and left. Inside the niches, a huge sarcophagus. Now it was known from the Egyptian historians, these are men who have already handed down thousands of stories, that the ancient Egyptians worshipped a holy bull. The bull was called Apis. Just to be clear, there were different bulls in ancient Egypt, also quite ordinary bulls, cows, but one of them was Apis. He was holy. And the Apis, so the historians say, had a different fur, a different moustache, 3 dots on the head, a star on the tongue. He was so holy that the people were not even allowed to touch him, let alone chase him, kill him, hold him, eat him. Nothing was allowed to happen to this holy bull. The historians even wrote that Apis was a monster. He often brought smaller temples to collapse. He chopped down fields, killed pigs and swine, and the people were afraid. They were not allowed to do anything to the animal. All this was known, and it was also known that the ancient Egyptians mummified every form of life. Every, not just humans. They mummified scorpions, fish, birds, monkeys, spiders, cats, dogs, whatever you imagine. Everything has been mummified. And where are these animals? Right here in the tunnels under Saqqara. Kilometre-long tunnels, right and left corridors and nests. There are 200,000 mummified crocodiles, 5 million mummified birds. Ibiza, the purest Noah, under the earth. In the middle of the last century, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was here. Not down there. That was not yet discovered. He was up on the desert sand. He wrote later that he was discouraged. He was a little hungry and thirsty, and stumbled over a stone. When he got up, he was able to decipher the glyph Apis on the stone. Auguste Mariette knew the story of the Holy Bull. He knew that there was an animal, but nobody had ever found a mummy of Apis. Mariette also knew that the Egyptians had mummified every animal, so there had to be a mummy of Apis. And now she is standing in front of a stone with the inscription Apis. Auguste Mariette was quite happy. He said, somewhere around here I will find for the first time bull mummies of this holy Apis. By the way, Auguste Mariette did not go about his work as carefully as archaeologists do today. Today it goes very gently, with spatula and brush. Auguste Mariette has always sunk dynamite poles into the ground. Then it banged and holes were blown out, and with such a bang he slipped afterwards, very personally, down on the ground. When you reached him in the torch, when the dust had moved, he stood in front of this sarcophagus. Auguste Mariette was overjoyed. He said to himself, I did it. This can only be a sarcophagus of a holy Apis bull. The lower part is 90 to 100 tons heavy. The lid alone is another 30 tons. I myself am 1.68 meters tall. If I hold my hand up, I can reach the lid of this huge sarcophagus. Now you have to know something else. The material of this sarcophagus is made of Aswan granite. Aswan is a city about 1,000 km away from here, on the Nile. At that time, in ancient times, there were 2 cataracts on the Nile. Cataracts are current, fast. This means that the heavyweights had to be transported down from the ships a few kilometers ashore, back on the ship for the rafts, and the whole thing twice. Now I ask you, dear viewers, to make the following assumption. Here in Saqqara, work troops are on the move, clearing underground tunnels for kilometers, right and left. 1,000 kilometers away in Saqqara, there are other work troops. They break the hardest granite they had in ancient Egypt, the Aswan granite, from the rock. The irregular pieces have to be polished. Look at the picture. How the stone has been polished from the inside with these precise edges. Then the heavy weights are transported down to Saqqara, bringing them into the underground passages. Auguste Mariette knew all of this. He was absolutely convinced. I find in here the holy bull mummies, because only for holy animals one makes such a forceful effort. One got a chisel, the men put themselves on boards, the first covers were lifted away, and Auguste Mariette made a scream. He wrote later, the first breath almost burned his lungs. He could hardly breathe any more. The men went to the surface, to the desert. They rested for 20 minutes. Then they went down again with wet towels around their faces. All sarcophagi were filled to the top with bitumen. Bitumen is natural asphalt. In ancient Egypt there were asphalt lakes. There are still a few of them today. It bubbles out of the ground like this. Later this stinking mass was used, pulled out with spades, transported in trucks and kicked up into the desert, and there must have been other acids in the smelly asphalt, and thousands of small splintered bones of various animals were found. How is that possible? The ancient Egyptians mummified every form of life because they were convinced of rebirth. They believed that in order to be reborn, the body had to remain preserved. And here you experience exactly the opposite. A tremendous amount of work, underground tunnels, transport of thousands of kilometers, heavy weights and all that just for chopped bones.
That doesn't make any sense. How could we solve this riddle?
I have a little speculation about this. It is not as wild as it looks. There are at least texts for it. At the end of the Pharaoh's reign, there was an Egyptian priest called Manetho. Manetho wrote down the whole Egyptian history from the beginning. He wrote that 11,341 years ago, in his time, the gods were here. The gods would have helped the people. They would have built schools and roads and showed the people how to do it. And suddenly, the gods would have created a mixed being. What is a mixed being? At least one thing every viewer knows. The Sphinx, the Sphinx, the Sphinx are stripes of the donkey's shadow. So a lion's body with a human head is a mixed being. Mixed beings can be found in all museums. Go to Asia, start in Turkey. The craziest combinations, and we were always of the opinion that this is artistic freedom. For example, the pharaoh wanted to symbolize the power of the lion. Now this priest Manetho comes with his writings and claims that the gods would have made mixed beings. He gives a whole list of what kind of mixed beings existed at that time. And all these monsters, these chimeras one would say today, were all holy, including the holy Apis. I could imagine the following. I know from ancient India, and not only from ancient India, that once motherships circled the earth. From the mothership came small carriers. The ancient Indians called them vimanas. Here the Egyptians called them the parks of the gods. From the carriers came the so-called gods, astronauts from another solar system. We all know that there are no gods, but the ancients just believed that there were gods. At some point the so-called gods made a few genetic manipulations, namely with the existing life here. There were already bulls, there were already crocodiles, there was already everything possible on Earth. Yes, why? At least in the world you should do something like that. A space-traveling species that has been on the road for centuries or millennia, of course, knows the most diverse planets. Not everyone has to look like us. Some planets are closer to the sun, it is hotter. Others are further away, it is cooler. Or they are bigger, the attraction forces are stronger. Now they are making mixtures to test which species would perhaps be more sensitive to heat. How about a lion with a crocodile tank, or with some kind of bull-human mixture? The legend of Minotaurus in Greece. Or here, they create such a monster, the holy Apis. They forbid the people to kill the animal for years because they want to observe it. At some point, however, the work of these so-called gods is over. They retreat to their small carrier ships, and from there to the mothership and away. And at that time, some of these monsters were still alive. As long as they lived, no priest, no human dared to approach the animals. Now they waited until the animals of a natural death died. Then they chopped the bones, built underground violence facilities, transported the heaviest sarcophagi the world has ever seen from a distance of 1,000 kilometers, threw the chopped bones in and put greasy, sticky, poisonous asphalt onto and only a 30-ton lid. What for? These monsters should never be reborn. Since I am half-grown, people argue about the Great Pyramid. Now in practice, it is not as if I only had a crash with some archaeologists worldwide. Thank God I have a very good network of contacts. Among the Egyptologists, I know a whole series of outstanding, integral, humorous, and spiritual men. Only, we have different views here and there. That's not a shame. The dispute is good, and as far as the Great Pyramid is concerned, all experts say to me I should finally stop asking stupid questions. This is a really secure opinion. You know who built the building, when and how it happened. The experts are convinced that the Great Pyramid of Gizeh was built by a pharaoh named Cheops. This was around 2500 BCE. So from today on, around 4,500 years in the past. Cheops, according to the experts, was a tyrant. Up to 100,000 people would have worked for him. Whether voluntarily or not, you can argue about that. Cheops had only 2 rooms in his building. The upper room is called the King's Chamber, the lower one the Queen's Chamber, the lower one the Queen's Chamber. However, there is actually a 3rd room in the rock under the pyramid. It is called the Unfinished Tomb Chamber. After all, the corridors to the 3 rooms in total. That's all. The rest is a compact stone. What do the old Arabs say about it? And by old Arabs, I don't mean a grandfather who likes to watch here. I mean the Arab historians. They also existed. Often when I talk to Egyptologists about the Arab historians, they tell me, Mr. von Daeniken, you can't take that seriously. These are fairy tales, or you don't know all the historians of the Arabs at all. Have you ever read something by an Ibrahim Abdul al-Masudi or an al-Makritsi? Arab historians. What does the Arabic literature say about the building? A completely different story. The Arabs claimed that the whole thing took place before the Great Flood. At that time, people were so primitive that they drank the same drink as the animals. But then the clouds had opened up. From the clouds came the barks, the ships of the gods. First of all, the ship of god Osiris. These gods would have first built schools in the land of Nile. Then they would have been swarmed. Everyone would have had a club in their hand, and they would have brought our ancestors to the schools. Maybe we should introduce that again. After a while, I found out that people were very thirsty for knowledge. When I read that, I was very calm. Apparently, we were not stupid before millennia. The most intelligent of our ancestors, so the old Arabs write, was a young boy named Surat. The Arab historians then note in a parable very precisely, Surat is. The Arab is the same as the Hebrews called Henoch. Doesn't tell you anything, just as a parable. The story takes place before the flood according to Arabic tradition. Surat was the smartest of us. Surat is the same as the Hebrews call Henoch, who is Henoch, before the flood. Go to the Bible or the Torah. Before the flood there were 10 patriarchs. One of the 10 was called Henoch, according to biblical tradition. Henoch is the first man to leave this planet in a fiery carriage. I have to think. I'll stick to the Arabic word, Surat. This Surat was the smartest. The teachers would have taught him their language. The young Surat is soon bilingual. He can speak his own language, and that of strangers. Now he serves as an interpreter. Then they would have given him a fast-writing device. I never understood what they mean. What is a fast-writing device? And finally, they would have dictated in books. At the same time, the knowledge would have arisen. A terrible flood would search the earth and all people, and all flesh would have to die. Of course, the young Sarite also heard this. Maybe he was already 18, 19 years old. He knew the language of the strangers, so he went to them courageously and literally accused them. He said, "Why did you bring me letters? Why did you dictate books to him? Now, where the water comes from, we all drown, even if a few people remain. They have to start all over again." And so he constantly asked to be allowed to build a monumental building. He wanted to put many small chambers in the building and put his books in the chambers, because time was running out. Time was running out because of the coming flood. If the teachers had helped this Surat with the planning, only during the planning, according to the Arabic tradition, no stranger pushed stones around, no one got their fingers dirty. The people did it. But during the planning, they would have helped him. Surat and his people built the Great Pyramid. He put many chambers in it, put his books in it. In 4 chambers there are even gifts from the teacher for future generations. After all, he made the whole pyramid waterproof by sealing everything from top to bottom with stones. At least that's true. The Great Pyramid was completely sealed on all 4 sides. Today it looks so terrible because the Arabs have been tearing the stones away for centuries. These plates were so beautifully cut that they were used to build the city wall of Cairo for government buildings, mosques, but also for private houses. That's why it looks like this today. Every time I tell my friends about the Egyptology, these Arabian stories, they come to me with a glass of wine, and they say to me, "But please don't take it seriously." The Arabs were several storytellers. You think of 1001 Nights, Ali Baba and the 40 Robbers. Sesame, Open Up, great stories, but none of them are true. In the best case, you have spoken nicely to your king. What is right, our opinion or that of the old Arabs? Are there rooms of unknown kind in here? If you, as a tourist, enter the Great Pyramid, then first of all you climb up here. I might have to say you cough up here. This is called the ascending corridor. It is 1 meter and 2 centimeters high. In practice, this means down with your head, down with your shoulders, down into your knees. In the duck, waddle, walk, you crawl up here. The sweat breaks out of all your pores. You can throw away your underwear afterwards. I often stand at the end of the route, it's 26 meters, and wait for my tourists. Everyone arrives dripping wet. The ladies have glued wet hair. So, ladies, if you crawl into the pyramid, go to the hairdresser afterwards, not before. Your hair won't stand it. After 26 meters, everyone says, oh, ah, ooh, because now you stand here. This is called a large gallery. This is called a large gallery. The route is 7 meters long, 9 meters high, and here begin the first justified questions to my friends of Egyptology. Can someone explain this to me? Why did the builders of the pyramids first make a tiny, low corridor, so low that they had to crawl through? So low that they couldn't even transport a sarcophagus, not even a sarcophagus lid. And then, after 26 meters, this crazy layout. Each layer of stone is 8 come higher than the next. This is how a corridor is created, which is pointed upwards. Here, stone beams of up to 70 tons have been used. An incredible work. The fantastic planning must be behind it. But Cheops and his people, who were supposed to have done it, only came out of the stone. How did this miracle become possible? In the Mystery Park in Interlaken, we put together a computer animation to explain the miracle. You don't have the answer. For example, there was this story about the ramp. But the ramp has to be adapted to the new height every day, without interruption. On the whole length, you can have a cramp somewhere. The same applies if you build a spiral ramp around the pyramid. The ramp would have a length of around 4 km at the end. She would have more volume, more content than the pyramid itself. There were other suggestions. Here, something great had succeeded in terms of organization. Thousands, tens of thousands of workers had been directed. It is said so easily. It takes training, it takes experience, it takes ropes that were not there. The various solutions that were presented are all taken for granted. If you take stones with wooden coats, as you can see here, then you have to invent it first. The screw of the Archimedes was not suddenly there. Eureka! Someone had to come up with that and try it out. But Cheops and his people came from the Stone Age. It has been said that the stones were whipped up. They spoke of lifting stages. They spoke of bottle pulls. All kinds of things came into play. Every solution is conceivable, but it puts too much at the beginning. It puts too much at Mr. Cheops and his people, who come directly from the Stone Age. By the way, our Egyptologists are absolutely convinced that the three pyramids here on the plateau of Gizeh were built at different times. Cheops, Hephren, Mykerinos. The old Arabic literature says something else. The pyramids were all built at the same time by this Sorite. Inside the pyramid, there are these shafts from the Queen's chamber in 2 directions, to the north and south. If you extend the shafts to certain equidistant dates, spring beginning, autumn beginning, then you precisely aim at the constellations Orion and Sirius. But the oldest god of the Egyptians was Osiris. Osiris is the same as Orion. The ancient Arabs say the 3 pyramids do not coincidentally stand like this. They represent the belt stars of the constellation Orion. Osiris is the same, and on the other side, Isis is godmother. In our solar system, we speak of inner and outer planets. The inner planets, seen from the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and then the outer ones. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are 3 chambers that distance the distances of the inner planets exactly. The Great Pyramid, by the way, does not stand randomly anywhere. It stands exactly where the distance to the Earth's center of gravity is equal to the distance to the North Pole. All this and much more may be coincidence. If you only accept 2 or 3 coincidences, then it gets dangerous. Now we know, this has been known for 10 years, that in the Queen's chamber, the smaller chamber in the Great Pyramid, there are 2 shafts. One in the south wall and one in the north wall. This is the shaft in the south wall. Now you should know, dear viewers, this shaft has only been around for 100 years. 100 years ago, the wall was closed. There was no shaft. 100 years ago, an Englishman came. That was Mr. Dixon. He tapped the walls with a hammer. At 2 points it sounded hollow, south and north. Only now did Missner get a hammer, pointed out 6 centimeters, and discovered a shaft behind it. If you light the lamp, the shaft runs about 2 meters horizontally, flat. Then you can see in the beacon cone, it goes so diagonally up inside the pyramid. The whole technical world was always of the opinion that both shafts are symbolic shafts. One speaks of so-called soul shafts. And the Mitnicker Society is grateful. Soul shafts, that's the solution. Of course, they wanted to determine whether these shafts at the outer edge of the pyramids would return to daylight. They don't do that. That's why, in specialist circles, they were of the opinion that the shafts should be at best 8, at most 10 meters long. Then they would end up blind. A young engineer from Germany, Rudolf Gantenbrink wanted to know more about it. He said to himself, "You can see that today with modern technology. What would it be like if I drove into the shaft with a toy car? Toy cars are controlled by radio. Forward, return, stop, etc. And then suddenly the young engineer Gantenbrink had doubts. He said to himself, wait a minute. If my toy car is maybe 40 meters in the shaft, and now I give a radio signal, it should stop and drive back. But for some reason, my radio signal does not arrive. That stupid thing can stick in there. What then? Imagine 500 years in the future, our descendants will find the toy car in there. I can well imagine what kind of locks they will pull out of it. If it is not possible with toy cars, then a high teach has to come. Mr. Gantenbrink had the possibility to construct a special robot. The basis was a steel grip. Then came electric motors, a special video camera, 2 halogen headlights, finally a laser beam, with which you measure the distance to the next wall, then rubber straps like a tank. The upper part can be pushed up with a hydraulic. This gives power to the ceiling. Because for this robot, if you can't control it via radio, you need cables. You have to pull cables with you, so you need power. That's why the rubber ropes. And then, just over 10 years ago, a new adventure began in the Great Pyramid. While you see these pictures, dear viewers, you have to be very clear. This shaft was created at the same time as the construction of the pyramid. It doesn't work the other way around. You can't finish the pyramid first. And then a priest comes along and says, hey, I still need a soul shaft. That's great. The shaft is 20 centimeters long. At this size, you can't fit a Lilliputian anymore, with chisel and hammer. So the shaft must have been created during the construction. Everything you see on the screen was planned. There was daylight in here. It was only dark when the pyramid grew, and the next ceiling stone, the ceiling plate came on top. Down in the Queen's chamber, the experts sat and watched on their monitors the journey of this robot in there. And the faces of the experts were getting longer and longer. Suddenly, scratches appeared, grinding marks, both vertical and horizontal. The walls were constantly changing, sometimes limestone, then it was sandstone. There were gate-like openings made of granite. Suddenly, the walls and the ceiling had been cleaned with limestone pebble. This must have been done outside, i.e. stirring limestone, placing pebbles with a mortar on the plate, letting them dry, and then putting them on the plates. Why? We do not know. Finally, during the journey, there was a hindrance. A stone balcony was laid across this shaft. The robot had to be directed several times upwards. It had to be filed down, shrunk, made a little lower, until it finally took this height. In the meantime, 40 meters were laid back in the shaft, and then it was 50 and 60. And the professionals did not dare to look at their eyes anymore. Suddenly, a door actually appeared. The door had something like 2, how shall I say, small slits. One of them was broken off. The broken piece lay on the floor at the bottom right. What was that? By the way, the wall here is made of alabaster, and this is only the beginning of the story. You see how the laser beam goes through at the bottom. The broken piece is made of metal, but Cheops should have been Stone Age. How does that fit? The beginning of history, 11 years ago, was a Japanese team of scientists of different disciplines. Interdisciplinary, they call it. A team that was Cedar University in Tokyo, the Great Pyramid with the most modern equipment. There is a thick scientific report, which is of course secret, of which I have a copy. In this report, you read all the measurements from a whole labyrinth of chambers and corridors in the Great Pyramid. Why does nothing happen in public? The discovery of Rudolf Gantenbrink is now around 11 years old. You see below, right in the picture, a small triangle is missing. For 11 years, one could have put an endoscope down there. The doctors do that every day, if it has to be. For 11 years, the public was kept in the dark. Rudolf Gantenbrink was offered an honest job. Why? Did he do something wrong? He was accused. Because of him, the whole thing came to the public eye. I asked back, why shouldn't it come to the public eye? Who is doing the secrecy here? Not us. The other side. The edicide. The Egyptologists in Cairo, not the Egyptologists here in our country. They don't even know what's happening in Cairo. Nothing happened for 11 years. Rudolf Gantenbrink got rid of him. And then the agency in Cairo made a new contract with the Stony American Society. That is National Geographic Society. A tax-free society. Has a very good reputation. National Geographic built a new robot. Then, on September 17, 2002, now, for the first time, in front of the eyes of the world, a hole is drilled into this door. For the first time, a camera is pushed through. During the broadcast, the journalist asked Prof. Dr. Sayavas, is the head of the authorities, asked him, Is this the first time that you push a camera through? Yes, he said. We are all completely excited about what is happening here. Unfortunately, this statement did not correspond to the truth. The hole had already been drilled 14 days earlier. The camera had already been pushed through. The Egyptologists in Cairo knew that the second door came behind this door. If they had found a room behind it, according to the old writings of the Egyptologists, the historians, then they would never have been allowed to show the film to the public. Why not? If there is a room somewhere, there is something in it. You don't build a shaft and a door and have a room behind it and it is empty. And what would have been in it would not have quite fit into the public image. That's why the secret creamery. I'm often asked, this is unscientific. It is indeed, but also science is bound to the rules of society. In the Arab countries, it is very often about religion, and religion is equal to politics, and equal to politics, and equal to society. Imagine the old Arabic writings were right, and in the pyramid you would find rooms with deliveries of times before the flood. Now we humans have all grown up in some religion. I was raised Catholic. The Christians have the Old Testament as a pre-construction, the old history. Also in the Muslim religion, you know the stories of Moses, Solomon, Noah, etc. And of course also in the Jewish tradition. So the basis of the world religions is the same. One would suddenly discover books, writings which tell us something completely different about the flood of meaning than what we find in religious literature. That would be an occasion for much quarrel. So it is better to leave it. What I personally regret very much. The whole thing is not scientific. But let's change the subject. If you ever have the opportunity to fly to Peru, then you should not only fly to the heights where you have seen these strange stones, but also to the south. 500 kilometers south of the capital Lima lies a gigantic desert area called Nazca. If you stand there on the ground, you will not recognize anything. Sand, desert, dunes. In the background, mountains. Just like you fly over the same desert on an airplane. Suddenly lines appear from the ground, as you can see here. Figures of all kinds, fish, birds, monkeys, humans. But everything is so overproportioned, so large, that you can only see it from the air. On the ground you can hardly see anything. Of course, there are a lot of theories about this riddle in Nazca. The oldest theory comes from Mrs. Maria Ricci, a young lady who had already come to Peru in 1941. She intended to crack this nut. She sacrificed her life here. Mrs. Ricci once believed that the whole thing was an astronomical calendar. The calendar variant is long gone. Mrs. Ricci died a few years ago. Highly regarded in Peru, she also deserved it. But at the end of her life she was bitter and said, maybe it has something to do with shamans or ghosts. Then others came, for example the American Jim Woodman. He believed that Nazca was nothing more than the balloon launch site for the hot air balloons of the Inca rulers. Widerena spoke of a cult for the water gods, a cult for the mountain gods, a cult for the mountain gods. In a whole orgy of cult. But you never have anything in your hands. It reminds me of certain luxury restaurants. Everything on the bill, nothing on the plate. For the mystery park in Interlaken, we filmed Nazca with a helicopter. And I have put together a very short clip here. It's not about these figures, the fish, birds, monkeys, people you see somewhere, but it's about these strange lines. By the way, I didn't write in any of my books that they are the landmines of the aliens, although I am clever to quote journalists all the time. I have called it a cult, but a cult that originally had something to do with aliens. You see lines in the mountains here. The longest of these lines is 3.8 km long. In between there are narrow lines. Such a narrow line is only 1 meter wide, but here the longest is 23 km long, like drawn with the ruler, over stone and mountain and valley in a straight line. Nazca is a single gigantic riddle, despite all attempts to explain it. There is cult thinking for every possible variant, but the actual riddle has not been solved to this day. On the pictures here you see something like stairs. After a lecture, a psychologist once said, I should imagine a bouquet of flowers here. An engineer laughed and said, that was the runway lighting. We do not know what it was. I do not know either. But we put this problem in the mystery park in Interlaken for discussion. Nazca is mysterious. Be it day, be it night. In Nazca, you literally learn to marvel again. There are things here that you don't see anywhere else in the world, that you don't just get under one hat. The various possibilities of thinking are conceivable, probably things we haven't even thought of. In these pictures you can see that we are in the mountains. The normal mountain runs from two sides to the mountaintop. Where this line is on, that was once such a mountain that ran from two sides to the mountaintop. Someone has climbed the whole mountain, and that's one of several. What has happened here, under the slope, like lines you can see zigzag lines, so it was not about scratching away the surface structure with shoes, sandals, feet, stones. If that had happened, the zigzag line underneath would have disappeared. As you can see, it is still there. In the background you can see broken mountains. I was there several times and always looked for the exit, for the descent. Someone seems to have transported him away. And then there is another sensation in the dried-out mountains. Geometric representations. Very strange. If you have good eyes, you can recognize terrain sections. The dots and lines even run over the terrain sections. Now the whole thing is a few millennia old. Nobody knows what it was. But the question has to be, who made geometric messages so that the receiver had to be able to fly? Otherwise you can't see it. Now the pictures come from the past. I want to take a leap into the present. Remember that and pay attention to this. The phenomenon of these grain circles, for 17 years they have been emerging. Mostly England, but more and more in other countries. And for 17 years we have been told that this is all fake. Of course there are fakes. We also know fakers. There are whole troops of fakers. A few years ago, a Japanese TV company made a big attack on the University of London. They wrote on it with thick felt-tip pen. They are looking for students who are able to make the contours of a Toyota into a cornfield overnight. The students did it, and the next morning, a Toyota was there. Only 860 meters away, in the same night, a completely incomprehensible, huge sign was created. Today we speak of pictograms. For the fakes, the fakes, the fakes, the fakes first made their computer animations, their plans. Most of the time, they have a rope around their neck, and then at the bottom of their feet, they have a wooden bar that is connected to the rope. Then you step down the wooden bar, and in this way, the grain falls down. The grain breaks, for the most part, with what we can't explain. The halves are braided together like a braid, and not a single half is broken. Of course, I know people who claim that they themselves have falsified everything. 1 year ago, at a TV show with G and the Joush, Zdife, one of the falsifiers, said that you should only pay attention to the fact that all points can be reached via tractor tracks. If you look closely, you will notice that this is not true. Look at the individual points. There are no tractor tracks, not even small lines. Something is happening here that we can't explain. What it is I don't know either, but there are movies. There you can see how, for a few seconds, at night, something yellow, iridescent, shining, runs over these fields. And under the eyes of the movie, something like this is created. Maybe they try to give someone a message. Maybe they try to test someone. And we are too stupid and don't understand the message. We don't do anything else today. If we have gorillas or chimpanzees in the zoo, we give them wooden blocks in different colors and shapes, and observe if they can put them together correctly. And if they can't, we say, okay, they are stupid. Maybe someone from a similar point of view will look at us. We have to stay on the ground with both legs, it is said, and from the point of view of subsistence, the most impossible ideas come to us. When the phenomenon began with these grain circles, I read in the newspapers that it was nothing more than windmills. Okay, windmills make circles in the fields, but not things like that. The next idea I heard, no, it was a grumpy wild boar that ran around here. Then I assumed, no, they are intelligent ant species. Hardly any explanation is too stupid to talk away the reality. This picture was created within 4 minutes overnight. Can you fake this? It is not that easy. 20 years ago I had a lecture in a small circle of the American Space Agency of NASA. And there I also spoke about the prophet Ezekiel. I would like to explain this story to you quickly. Ezekiel is a figure of the Old Testament. It is called Ezekiel, or Ezekiel is always the same figure. And this Ezekiel figure writes in the Old Testament, pretty much at the end of the Old Testament, a highly exciting story. The story has been written down in the first person, in the form of the I of the one who experienced it. Ezekiel writes that he was in prison on a river in Babylon. And then the sky opened up. From the clouds, from the northeast, a vehicle rushed towards it. Suddenly, Ezekiel hears a terrible noise. He compares the noise with the thundering of a campfire, with the noise with the thundering of a lot of water. The men who work here are all afraid and throw themselves to the ground. Now Ezekiel is a professional high priest at the Temple of Jerusalem. He then believes in something divine, and therefore he has the courage and stands up first and gloriously describes what he sees. In front of him is a statue. Ezekiel calls it the glory of the Lord. Incidentally, in the entire Ezekiel text, Ezekiel never says the word God. He suspects something. He calls the statue the glory of the Lord. In the glory of the Lord was something like a gemstone, glittering and shining, and in the middle of the gemstone was something like a throne. On what looked like a throne sat a man looking like a human in a glittering robe. Under this throne Ezekiel saw living beings. They had wings. When the wings moved, an incredible noise arose, because he compares it to water and war. And among these wings and these living beings he saw wheels. Ezekiel describes it very precisely. The wheels were worked as if a wheel could go to all four sides without turning. If we have a wheel today, does it go forward or does it go backwards? When we make a turning movement, think of the steering wheel or a dike in a car, then the wheels turn. Ezekiel describes wheels that can go to all four sides, right, left, forward, and so on, without this turning movement. He writes, the wheels would have had rims and red eyes all around, and under the ravens I saw legs. The legs were made of metal. They flashed and blinked like white ore, etc., etc., etc. I don't want to go through the whole Ezekiel. At NASA 20 years ago, I just talked about Ezekiel, and I suggested that here in the Bible something technical was created or described. Later, the NASA engineers said that they didn't believe that any technology was hidden in the Bible. After all, the chief designer at the time, Mr. Joseph Blumrich, said to me with a laugh, Mr. von Daeniken, I want to read this Ezekiel, the whole Ezekiel, not just a few sections. He did that later. And he didn't just take one edition of the Bible, he took several editions of the Bible, because Ezekiel has different translations. These are the words that weigh a little differently. At the beginning, as Mr. Blumrich later told me, he smiled with the superior smile of a man who knows in advance that nothing good will come out of it anyway. And then he became more and more thoughtful. Suddenly, he grabbed his pencil and his work tool and started to take Ezekiel by the word, sentence by sentence. Everything was analyzed. What is he actually writing here? Two colleagues from NASA joined in. Both also space engineers. They asked, what are you doing here, Joseph? I take Ezekiel by the word. Nothing has fallen away. What did Ezekiel describe? This is the vehicle, the so-called glory of the Lord, according to the description of the Bible and according to the reconstruction of Joseph Plummerich of NASA. Ezekiel wrote something like in Edelstein, in his prime time. It was nothing more than the command capsule with a visor around it. He calls the whole thing the glory of the Lord. He describes the wings that make the terrible noise were helicopter units. Ezekiel describes it more precisely. He says when the wings stopped, they hung down. Then he describes the wheels, which could go to all four sides. At NASA, a new wheel was reconstructed. The wheel was divided into different segments. Each segment ends in its own axis. Of course, this wheel can go forward or turn backwards, but the wheel could also move towards you, the spectators. Then only the roller, which is in direct contact with the ground, turns. The same in the opposite direction. This wheel turns to all four sides without turning in its course. After all, the legs that were straight and sparkled like white ore. This reconstruction comes from the kitchen of NASA, and as I said, not a single sentence fell under the table. In the USA, a book was written about it, The Spaceship of Ezekiel. There is a German version, maybe you can find it in a library. In German, the book is called Da tat sich der Himmel auf by Joseph Blumrich. Now you have to know something else. The whole description of this technique can be found in Ezekiel from chapter 1 to chapter 40. And in chapter 40, something completely new happens. Ezekiel writes that this vehicle, this majesty of the Lord, came again, a second time. He writes, the hand of the Lord took it, and they put me on the throne. In my view, he is sitting on the chair of the co-pilot. Then Ezekiel writes, the hand of the Lord weighed heavily on my chest. They started, he felt the impression. Finally, he said, they brought me to a very, very high mountain. He emphasizes this twice, a very, very high mountain. And below me, he writes, was something like a city. This building here, this majesty of the Lord, flew into the middle of the city. Down there was something like a temple, and the building flew into the middle of the temple. The temple cannot have had a roof. Finally, it becomes quiet. Ezekiel is allowed to get out. And outside the temple wall he is already expected. There is one. Ezekiel describes him. He was to be seen as a man in Ori. So the stranger glittered and shone in the sun. This man in Uz makes fun of Ezekiel at first. He spits and says, "You people, you have eyes to see and see nothing, and you have ears to hear and hear nothing." Suddenly, the stranger has a measuring stick, such a measuring stick in his hand, gives this measuring stick to Ezekiel, and orders him to measure the whole building. Ezekiel still has the courage to ask back. He asks the man who glitters there, "Why? Why should I do that?" And the stranger answers very cool, "That's why we brought you here, so that you do that." And so Ezekiel begins to measure. Length, width, front yard, inner yard, stairs. Read it, dear viewers. Make the effort, grab the Bible. From chapter 40, pages long dimensions. You will not find something like that anywhere in the Bible, only in the words of the prophet Ezekiel. The German engineer Hans Herbert Bayer stumbled upon these measurements. Mr. Bayer is a specialist in large buildings. He also took Ezekiel in his words. He also did not omit a single sentence, not a centimeter. He added or omitted it. He added or omitted it. He adhered exactly to the guidelines of the prophet Ezekiel in the Bible. He wanted to know, what kind of structure is this that he describes here? Here is the result. The so-called temple was in reality nothing more than the base station. One could say the base camp for this extraterrestrial carrier spaceship. I have often had debates with geologists about Ezekiel. The theologians, of course, have a completely different opinion. The theologians are of the opinion that Ezekiel had the vision of a future temple. He describes the temple of a future Jerusalem. But something is left under the table here. Ezekiel writes, "You brought me to a very, very high mountain." Where in Jerusalem is there a very, very high mountain? I know the area, a few hills, then it's done. Then he writes, "Under me was something like a city." If it had been Jerusalem, he would have called it by name. He grew up in Jerusalem, he knows his city. By the way, there are German Bibles where the word Jerusalem is included. In the original Hebrew, there is no word for Jerusalem. Then he writes, in the middle of the city there was something like a temple. Wait a minute. Why? Like a temple? He himself is the archpriest at the temple? He must know what a temple is. Something is being mixed up here. Ezekiel has no vision. He is an excellent descriptor. What has actually happened? Phil's co-pilot. And then the journey begins. He writes, "The hand of the Lord weighs heavily on my chest." He feels the impression at the arrival, but of course does not know what it is, and the journey goes up to a place where he does not know where he is. It is neither Israel, nor is it near Jerusalem. St. Peter mentioned it in the name. He says, "Yes, you brought me to a very, very high place." We have always been told that everything that is written in the old texts, especially in the so-called holy books, we would have to believe. Meanwhile, thank God, we have become critics. Also the semantics, the exegetes, the exegetes, the specialists for the Old Testament have noticed for a long time that some things were not as we believe them to be. Finally, a small example that was always very amazing to me. Everyone here knows Abraham, of course. Abraham was supposed to be our ancestor. The story I'm telling you right now, you won't find it in the Bible. There are many little stories outside of the Bible, which you can find in thick books, such as old Jewish scripture outside of the Bible. And the story I'm going to tell you now comes from this old Jewish scripture. Abraham was a young man, about 12 years old. It was evening. He was working on his father's field. Suddenly he heard a noise similar to Ezekiel in the clouds. The boy looks up and sees with his eyes like a vehicle, reckoning on the field on which he is working. Of course he is scared. The boy sprints away and has the bad luck to fall to the ground. He remains scared. After a short time he is grabbed by the shoulders and put on his legs. And now the boy writes, I quote this literally, "There were two beings, as I have never seen them on earth." They do not have the breath of a human being. If they are not human beings, then what are they? Beings that you have never seen on earth. They are not ghosts. They are not ghosts. They do breathe, but they do not have the breath of a human being. The two strangers apparently have to master the language of the young boy, and there comes a wall that constantly meets me. They ask me, "Mr. von Daeniken, how in the world are these aliens supposed to have talked to our ancestors?" Nothing easier than that. Dear viewers, let's go back about 150 years into the past. Imagine that the first British researchers come to Australia. There they come across the natives, the Aborigines. Or the first researchers come to the heart of Africa. For the first time, they come across Pygmies or Zulus. All these peoples, whether Australia or Africa, had languages that have not the slightest in common with our language. In part, cis languages, Grunz languages, Grunz languages. This has never prevented us from talking to them for a few months. We also talk to Japanese, Indians, and Chinese today. The language was never a problem. This is a matter of observation, of imitation, it goes very far. So in this case here, the strangers have apparently studied the people a bit. They speak the language of this boy, and they try to calm him down for the first time. Several times they say, "Son of man, do not be afraid." If it had been the dear God, he would have known what the guy's name was. He would have said, "Abraham, do not be afraid." But the strangers do not know the name, Son of Man. The boy was still afraid. I can feel it in him. I would have been afraid myself. Then the following happens, and I quote from the Abraham Apocrypha, old Jewish scripture outside the Bible. The two strangers grabbed me. They dragged me to the edge of the flame. Then we climbed up, as with many winds. I see in the air, in that height that we ascend, something like a mighty light, indescribable, and in that light something like fire. And as we come closer, great figures who call each other words that I do not understand. I would like to start again briefly. They drag him to the limit of the flames of fire. They ascend as if with many winds. He knows exactly there are no winds. He has no other word for it. He sees in that height something like a mighty light. Says still explicitly, not to describe. They come to the light. The boy sees great figures, who call each other words that he does not understand. Logically, not. They speak in their language, and the earthman does not know them. Who still has doubts about what is going on here? In the next sentence, everything becomes crystal clear. The boy writes, "But I wish to fall down on the earth. If someone wish to fall down on the earth, then he can hardly be on the earth. And who does not yet know what is going on, everything becomes clear." The boy writes, "The high place on which we stood, once he stood upright, but then it turns downwards. Once I saw the earth above, and then the stars below. It cannot be more beautiful. Move, dear viewers, in a mothership outside the earth, in an orbit. This mothership will always turn around its own axis. Why? Because of this self-rotation, centrifugal force is created inside. It acts like an artificial gravity. They are no longer weightless. They have a floor under their feet. Thousands of years ago, no one could know that. Whether he is now Abraham or Eggsy is not so important. And what does the boy deliver? I wish to fall down on the earth, the high place where we stood. Once he stood upright, then he turned down again. Sometimes I see the earth above and the stars below." And all this is thousands of years old. The quote from the Abraham Apocalypse is one of many quotes. We have made the effort to interpret many old texts in a modern way. Whether it is the right answer, we do not know. But it is at least as meaningful as the answer yesterday, where we were asked to believe. I have remained a believer. I am one of the few people who still pray every day. But the dear God whom I believe in does not need to rummage around with their vehicles that smoke and beep and stink and cause noise, have rims and wheels, wens and wheels. Then we would have to stick to something else. I call the dear God to whom I pray the great spirit of creation. Imagine I would be right. We would have been visited by thousands of extraterrestrials, and they would have infected our ancestors. And they would have infected our ancestors. Our ancestors believed they were gods. We know there are no gods. And let's assume I was right. Then the next question must be, where did these extraterrestrials come from? From another solar system. And where did the others come from? Again from another solar system. You can continue playing the game as long as you want. Over millions of years into the universe, space and time are enough. In the end, they are where the flagpole stops, and at the latest, then you become very small and say respectfully with the religions, here is creation, here is creation, here is God. You do not lose the dear God if you deal with such thought. I hope that in the future you will have more such thoughts, and wish me, of course, that sooner or later you visit the Mystery Park in Interlaken. Because there you will learn to marvel again. Because there you will learn to marvel again. There this fascinating vibration of curiosity will be put into motion. Thank you very much.